চরণ তলে একলা তলরে যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলরে যদি আলো না ধরে ওরে ওরে ও আলো না ধরে যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় করে তবে বজ্রা দলে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলরে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলরে যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলরে একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো রে
Hi guys, the reason I'm late again today is because I'm having a tough time with OBS. It's very simple in some ways, it's just complex in others, which is there was a bunch of stuff in StreamYard that you could do with one click that you can't in OBS. You have to do a whole bunch of steps manually. And I keep forgetting them every day, and there are not even same steps. I have to do something or the other differently every day so that it's better every day. So today I'm so far displaying the paper on the right hand side. I think I don't need to show you all the paper, right? I'll just go around reading it from my screen. You all don't have to see it, you all just can look at my face. And yesterday after the live stream I realized that I could not see a bunch of really nice comments on my OBS live chat. They were visible only on the YouTube original live chat. Lol. OBS is open source, yes. There is no free lunch. So guys, this is obviously the I think the most epic paper on matters of caste in India. The biggest weapons you can use against any mainstream politician, thinker, normie who believes in reservations hardcore and believes all the myths surrounding caste, all the mainstream narrative lies surrounding caste, the rigidity of it, how much is Hinduism to blame for it, etc. All of that. And who destroys all of that? Irfan Habib. We will go through this epic paper. First I will live real, yes it is live. First I will tell you all the bullet points, okay? Because I know a lot of y'all don't like to listen to too long live streams. Decreasing attention span ka zamana hai. So let's get this away with for now. Let's not see this for now. How to stop this window capture? I have no idea. I thought full screen meant this. Anyway, we will keep it somewhere else. Great. So let me tell you all the bullet points, okay? The key takeaways, the key fascinating takeaways which I have posted on Twitter many times and they have gone viral each time. I will just read them out to you first. Everything you know about Irfan Habib and everything you think you know about caste, all will be shattered tonight. Any updates on the battle with Shritankar? Is it still going on? What is Shritankar? I don't know. Hold on. I'm opening Twitter. If you go to Twitter and type Irfan Habib, probably if not on the very first thing on the feed, one of the second or third will be my tweet on this paper. He also called Mughals parasitical, by the way. We have done a discussion on that paper as well. Yeah, here it is. And if you follow me on Twitter, guys, I'm resharing it right now. Make it go viral again. I'll just quote tweet and share it again saying time to make this paper viral again. Okay, the page is taking some time to load. I will check out the comments by then. Ritankar. Who is Ritankar? What battle with Ritankar? You probably are talking about somebody else. It's still opening for some reason. Why is it so slow today? Let's see if this one opens. Yeah, got it. Irfan Habib's essay, Caste in Indian History, okay, from 1997. See the narrative direction that the Indian academia was getting towards. Mysteriously, the anti-Hindutva, the allegedly Congress-leaning academia. In 1997, that academia writes a paper which destroys every myth surrounding caste, which is believed by BJP, RSS, CPIM, all the leftist parties, Rahul Gandhi, everyone. Anybody who wishes for more reservation believes in this stuff on reservations, on caste. Oh, Ritam Karnath, oh, that battle, acha, acha. Oh, I forgot about him. Alright, no. That's too small a thing. So, here are some of the main key takeaways, okay? Louis Dumont is the guy whose research is laughed at inside academia but is taken seriously in politics for some reason because it gets everybody votes. Louis Dumont, one of the key takeaways of this paper is that Louis Dumont gets everything wrong about India. Habib critiques Dumont's hierarchical interpretation of the caste system, arguing that it fails to capture the complex socio-economic realities of Indian society. Next point. Caste has nothing to do with the Rig Veda. He asserts that the caste system did not originate from the Rig Veda, emphasizing that the text describes social classes rather than rigid castes. Birth-based hierarchies are non-existent in Rig Veda. Habib contends that there is no evidence of hereditary divisions in the Rig Veda, which he believes is more reflective of class distinctions than caste. Tribal accommodation/acceptance into larger society. He notes that many tribes were integrated into broader society over time, contributing to the evolution of caste. Tribes already practicing endogamy later became castes, for example, the Shakya clan of the Buddha. Habib highlights that tribes like the Shakyas practiced endogamy before being categorized as castes. Quote-unquote purity and quote-unquote pollution were later rationalizations of original economic phenomena. He argues that concepts of purity and pollution emerged as justifications for economic relationships rather than being foundational to caste itself. One of the main reasons for a Brahmin's power was his knowledge of calendars. Irfan Habib points out that Brahmins' expertise in calendars was crucial for agricultural planning, thus enhancing their social power. Caste as a system worked weakest for the ruling community. He claims that the beneficiaries of the caste system were often outsiders or usurpers rather than those in power. Next point, listen to this point. I hope audio and all, everything is fine. I'll just look at the comment section. Yeah. Buddhists took part in rationalizing the caste system by their belief in transmigration. Habib suggests that Buddhist beliefs inadvertently supported caste ideology through concepts like karma and transmigration. Buddhists subjugated animal-killing jatis. He notes that Buddhists often marginalized communities associated with animal killing, reinforced social hierarchies. Peasants became Shudras instead of Vaishyas. According to Habib, both Buddhists and Brahmins devalued peasants' roles in animal husbandry, relegating them to Shudra status. Caste ideology not exclusively Brahmanical. He argues that caste ideology was not solely a Brahmanical construct but involved various social dynamics. The hereditary occupation by caste was necessary to enable special skill to be accumulated from generation to generation. This is an exact line, almost. Habib emphasizes that hereditary occupations helped preserve skills within certain communities. Can you believe that? The hereditary transmission sustained skill while excluding even horizontal mobility. This point underscores how caste restricted mobility while ensuring job security within specific trades. Islamic quote-unquote raiders, okay, he calls them raiders. Islamic raiders ushered in quote-unquote Oriental despotism. He discussed how Islamic invasions contributed to a new form of governance that coexisted with existing caste structures. Muslim kings kept the caste system alive, protected it. Habib argues that Muslim rulers maintained the caste system rather than dismantling it. Muslim kings only had a problem with polytheism and idol worship, not the inequality of caste. Quote-unquote inequality of caste, according to Habib himself. He contends that their primary concern was religious orthodoxy rather than social inequality. Supremacy of Brahmins was not essential for the continuance of the caste system. Habib posits that Brahminical supremacy was not a prerequisite for maintaining caste structures. Islamic kings brought slave trade. He notes that Islamic rulers introduced slave trading practices into Indian society. Slaves were quote-unquote casteless non-Muslims who got converted to Islam. Habib explains how many slaves were outside the traditional caste framework and often converted to Islam. So it's not lower castes converting to Islam because of Brahmin Atyachar. Non-Muslim monotheist panths fought effectively against casteism, unlike Muslims. He highlights how certain non-Muslim sects actively resisted caste discrimination more effectively than Muslims did. Anti-casteism panths also encouraged endogamy. Despite their anti-caste rhetoric, these groups often promoted endogamous practices within their communities. Anti-casteism panths did not subvert the caste system but often only returned to it with higher rank. Habib concludes that many anti-caste movements ultimately reinforced existing hierarchies by seeking higher status within them, higher status. Hindu unity is important for India's progress. Finally, he emphasizes the necessity of Hindu unity as a means to foster societal progress and address caste-related issues effectively. These are the key takeaways, guys. Now, let's get to the original paper. How's it going, guys? Yeah, his views are pretty much the same even today. These are common mainstream Marxist views inside academia. Every Marxist academic agrees with Irfan Habib here, except only a very, very, very recent crop of Dalit scholars, Dalit caste scholars. Everybody else believes in this stuff. Oh, the beautiful gift of green tea. Let's discuss the full paper now, guys. Yengre, probably. He's taking it in a completely different direction anyway. But there's a crop of that's kind of scholars in India, Kolkata as well. Okay, where's the paper? Yeah. So, Irfan Habib writes, okay, here's the short bio on it. Caste, where am I reading this paper? Can you all believe that, guys? See the link. Check out what website is this. Are you all having fun? This website is called anticaste.in. Communists Against Caste, chronicling the role and views of communists in the struggle for the annihilation of caste. Caste in Indian History is a brilliant essay on the evolution of caste in India, written by renowned Marxist historian Professor Irfan Habib. It is the text of the inaugural D.D. Kosambi Memorial Lecture delivered in Bombay in March 1985. 1985. And was published in Professor Habib's book Caste and Money in Indian History, 1987. It was reproduced in the collection of Professor Habib's essays titled Essays in Indian History Towards a Marxist Perception, 1995, published by Tulika Books, New Delhi. Anticaste.in republishes this classic essay with the author's permission for the benefit of a larger readership. The text is from the 7th reprint 2007 of Essays in Indian History. But you do understand communists prefer to see society in class conflict rather than community conflict. Yes, and if that absolves Hinduism, why not focus on that? Caste is the most characteristic and many would say unique social institution of India. No interpretation of our history and culture can demand a hearing unless it encompasses... He's not saying it's uniquely an Indian situation, but he's saying it's a unique situation inside India. No interpretation of our history and culture can demand a hearing unless it encompasses the caste system. One of the abiding achievements of D.D. Kosambi's scholarship was his ability to unite a lively spirit of anthropological investigation with a critical analysis of historical evolution. I hope that by choosing the role of caste in Indian history as the theme of this lecture, I may be able to touch on some of Kosambi's most valuable insights. Any such endeavors must first come to grips with the problem of definition. It is not surprising that this should be difficult, but perhaps a working definition could still be attempted to serve us as a point of departure. Caste, we may say, is a fairly well-marked separate community whose individual members are bound to each other through endogamy and hypergamy, and very often also by a common hereditary profession or duty, actual or supposed. Many sociologists, however, appear to regard this definition as quite insufficient. They would add that we must also stipulate the existence of a perception of the rank of one caste in relation to other castes, a ranking which finds expression in the degree of purity and quote-unquote impurity of the other castes in relation to one's own, and in specific rites and practices followed by or assigned to each caste. Louis Dumont in his Homo Hierarchicus considers, as the very title of the work shows, the hierarchical principle to be the very core and heart of the caste system. Without it, there would be no caste. Whether we should follow the very simple definition we have suggested or the kind of definition that Dumont would approve of is not a mere matter of semantics. It is of crucial importance for understanding the history of our civilization. I therefore crave the reader's indulgence for examining Dumont's views in some detail. To Dumont, the caste system must be understood in terms of its essential religious, quote-unquote Hindu ideology, which pervades all the immense variety that it displays. It is reflected in the endless, complex, even conflicting arrangements of ranks, the highest belonging always to the Brahmins, who are the quote-unquote purest and command much of its ritual. The ranking does not originate in or correspond to the actual distribution of power or wealth, but, did you all listen to this line, guys? The ranking does not originate in or correspond to the actual distribution of power or wealth. Holy fuck. All commie propaganda destroyed in this sentence already. Wait. Sanjeev Sanyal just messaged me something. I'll just check what he wrote. Okay. Their use of identity politics is more common among neoliberals who use divide and rule to keep communities in perpetual conflict to keep control. He released a new education and contract document. I see. Now, I was asking him if tax incentives or like tax breaks for having more kids can solve the TFR problem or not. Or like if you, let's say you get some extra freebies, extra free government services if you have more than 2 kids, or you get tax breaks for having more than 2 kids, etc. Okay. Y'all can see me fine, right? I'll just check once. Yeah, this seems fine. Yeah, cool. So yeah, that epic line, guys. The ranking does not originate in or correspond to the actual distribution of power or wealth, but arises, so to speak, out of the basic elaboration of the basic principle of purity or pollution. Thus, neither are castes an extreme, quote-unquote, extreme form of classes, nor is the caste system a system of social stratification. It need not and does not correspond to the distribution of wealth or power. Dumont insists that caste must be understood as part of the whole, quote-unquote, a favorite phrase of his, which means that the entire society must be divided up among castes and there must be no significant residue. Thus, in effect, caste must exist as the sole or dominant form of social organization or not exist at all, according to Dumont, that is. If all this is to be accepted, if, that is, caste arose out of an ideology of quote-unquote purity, unfolding as an elaboration of hierarchy on the basis of relative quote-unquote purity, without any reference to economic phenomenon, then the economic impulse within Indian society must surely have been very weak. Further, if the caste system has given India an unchanging hierarchy, India can have had no history that one may recognize as such. Both these positions Dumont readily espouses, that India can have had no history that one may recognize as such, that it only has an unchanging hierarchy. I would like to raise, he says, the very question of the applicability to traditional India of the very category of economics. He says the very concept of economics is not applicable to India, only castes are. He points in justification to the quote-unquote elementary fact that even in our own Western society it was, according to Dumont, in our own Western society it was only at the end of 18th century that economics appears as a distinct category independent of politics. The argument is so illogical that one hesitates over whether one has understood Dumont all right. The fact that there was at one time no science of sociology does not mean that there have been no societies before the arrival of that science. Similarly, because economics did not exist as a science before the 18th century, one is not excluded from speaking of the economic factors behind the English Civil War or any other earlier historical process or event. Irfan Habib is trolling the fuck out of Louis Dumont. Can you all believe this tone and tenor of Irfan Habib? So too is India to be deprived of history. Dumont writes, the indifference to time, to happening, to history in Indian literature and civilization in general makes the historian's task very hard. But under these conditions, is there a history of India in a sense comparable to that in which there is a history of Christian civilization or even China? In other words, shall we say, no biography can be written of anyone who has not authored an autobiography. No biography can be written of anyone who has not authored an autobiography first by himself. Dumont offers here and there examples of how one can interpret India's quote-unquote non-history. The most impressive example is his exposition of the rise and fall of Buddhism. The ideology of the caste system, he says, requires individuals' renunciation of society. Some of the quote-unquote renouncers begin competing with the Brahmins. Out of such competition, the Buddhists and the Jainas expounded the doctrine of ahimsa and condemned animal slaughter and meat-eating as polluting acts. This led to Brahmanas to give up animal sacrifice and stress vegetarianism to a greater or more systematic degree than even their challengers. The Buddhists were thus thwarted, vegetarianism became yet another symbol of purity, and the Brahmanas slept more easily until the next round of renouncers, for example the Lingayats, came around with some other eccentric competing propositions. Kosambi may point to the shift from pastoralism to agriculture, R.S. Sharma to the rise of towns and growth of commerce, in order to explain the success of early Buddhism. But their attempts are vain. The only factor behind it was a more successful appeal to the quote-unquote idiom of purity, and what made such an appeal at all possible was again the phenomenon of quote-unquote renunciation. He is ridiculing Louis Dumont here by pointing out his circular argument. If such is to be the history of India, to fit a contemporary Western sociologist's image of the caste system, is it not more likely that there is something wrong with this image rather than with Indian history? It may in fact, guys, he sounds like a word starting with H almost, doesn't he? It may in fact well be that there is a good historical explanation for Dumont's excessively narrow view of caste. During the last 100 years and more, the hereditary division of labor has been greatly shaken, if not shattered. As a result, this aspect has increasingly receded into the background within the surviving domain of caste. The purely religious and personal aspects have, however, been less affected. One can see that this is by no means specific to India. Religious ideology survives long after the society for which the particular religion had served as a rationalization has disappeared. What a beautiful sentence. It is obviously tempting to take the caste system's surviving elements, mainly religious, as the sole or crucial elements, and the declining aspects, which are the economic ones, as secondary and even superfluous. Dumont not only falls to the temptation, he builds a whole theoretical structure on a false premise to explain what India is. But then, what he postulates about the hierarchical man in India is perhaps as difficult to accept as his other belief that Western society today is quote-unquote egalitarian. If then Homo hierarchicus fails to convert us, from where are we to begin? I think it is important to use the approach that Kosambi explicitly and consistently followed, the one that was introduced by Karl Marx. Caste should be viewed primarily in its role in different social formations that have arisen in a chain of sequence. A social formation, insofar as it is based on the form of labor process, arises after the producers in society are able to provide a surplus. It is vain to expect a social institution like caste to exist before this stage has arrived. Indeed, Dumo himself recognizes this, for he admits that the emergence of castes presupposes division of labor, which cannot be found in primitive societies, only in complex societies, advanced societies. The Purusha Sukta in the Rig Veda, the original statement of the four Varnas, is more a description of social classes than of castes. The Rajanyas, aristocracy, the Brahmanas, priests, the Vish, people at large, mainly peasants, and the Shudras, springing from the Dasyus, survival communities. There is no hint yet in Vedic times of either a hereditary division of labor or any form of endogamy. The Varnas thus initially presage very little of the caste system that was to grow later. Kosambi, in an introduction to the study of Indian history, offers the view that castes did not arise out of any internal division of the Varnas in the original Vedic society, but from an external process altogether. The entire course of Indian history shows tribal elements being fused into a general society. This phenomenon lies at the very foundation of the most striking Indian social feature, namely caste. For this insight, one can adduce confirmation from the use of the word jati. When the Buddha is spoken of as belonging to the Shakya Jati, the word obviously means a tribe. When in the same literature, we also read of excellent as well as low jatis, castes are clearly implied. Tribes are often rigorously endogamous. Thus, the Buddha's story of the Shakya brothers who married their own sisters in order to avoid marrying outside the tribe. Can we suppose that as the tribes entered the quote-unquote general society, they carried their endogamous customs into that society? If the tribe was already an agricultural community, it would simply turn into the peasant caste of its territory. Let me have a sip of green tea now. Here to learn, the only answer to caste is exclusive status groups. René Girard, Pierre Bourdieu, Max Weber. संघी टॉकिंग पॉइंट्स क्या धो रहा है भाई. However, the tribes, quote-unquote, entering the general society would include a large number of primitive hunting or food-gathering tribes living in forests, who would be subjugated by the advancing peasant communities. This may be illustrated by the struggle between the Shakyas and Kolis. Oh my god, Buddhists hate Virat Kohli's clan, holy shit. Kosambi has a long passage on the Nagas, the forest folk, who retreat before the Aryan advance, meaning the Brahmanical advances from northwestern India, or Pakistan, Afghanistan area, but leave their traces behind in Brahmanical lore and later Vedic ritual. As the food gatherers were subjugated, they were reduced to the lowest jatis, so low as to be outside the four varnas altogether. Just the four food gatherers. And who did this? Who retreat before the Aryan advance? The enumeration of the quote-unquote mixed jatis in the Manusmriti shows a preponderance of such communities. The Sair Andhra ensnare animals. The Kavarta are boatmen. I think Koiborto in Bengali, I guess. The Nishadas pursue fishing. The Medas, Andhras, Chunchus, the Madgus live off the slaughter of wild animals. The Kshatris, Ugras, and Pukkasas by catching and killing animals living in holes. Ugras are not the same as the Aguri caste in Bengal, right? The Ugra Kshatriya, the agricultural caste. Were they the previously Ugra caste? Possibly. Why else would they get the term Ugra? Ugra Kshatriya, although. But they were Aguri. Oh my god, who knows? The Karavara and Dhigvanas by working in leather, and the Pandushopaka by dealing in cane. The Chandalas and Nishadas both appear as hunters in Buddhist texts. These were the original quote-unquote untouchable castes. Since they were excluded from taking to agriculture, and their own original or altered occupations were of minor or seasonal importance, they became a large reservoir of unfree, servile, landless labor available for work at the lowest cost to the peasants as well as superior landholders. It is difficult to avoid the view that the bitter hostility which the rest of the population has displayed for these menial jatis had derived from this fundamental conflict of interest. Concepts of purity and pollution were a rationalization of this basic economic fact. The separation of the peasant and menial jatis represent a division of labor in a very generalized form. But R.S. Sharma has called attention to a second urban revolution, the first being represented by the Harappan culture, which took place on the eve of the rise of Buddhism. This implies that a multiplicity of productive skills must have developed. Gordon Childe has stressed the importance of new tools and labor-saving devices such as hinged tongs, shears, scythes, rotary querns for the emergence of a number of new full-time specialists. Some of these tools, like shears and rotary querns, appear by the 1st century AD at Takshila. The Jatakas introduce us to the manufacturers' villages, peopled by smiths and carpenters. It is possible that tribes brought wholesale into the general society began to throw off splinters under the pressure of the emerging division of labor. Different craftsmen isolated from the original tribe were formed into specific jatis. Thus, Manu includes among the mixed jatis those of carpenters, charioteers, and physicians. A similar process of differentiation based on the growth of commerce led to the mercantile castes, which are quite prominent in the Jatakas. In time, they would make the Vaishya Varna exclusively their own. The position of the Brahmanas in the caste framework derived naturally enough from their priestly functions and their guardianship of the dharma protecting the caste system. Kosambi suggests that part of their position also derived from their grasp of the calendar, which was so essential for regulating agricultural operations. If you could provide this extremely high-end academic service, bro, you are getting a high position in society, aren't you? Is there any other way? Yes, I do, Aga. I'm sorry, I wasn't looking at the comments, Rudrajit, so I don't know which line you are talking about now. I should read some lines for effect. Almost everyone seems agreed that in universalizing the caste system within India, Brahmanas have played a key role, and that by integrating the caste doctrine into the dharma, Brahmanas made the caste system and Brahmanism inseparable. One result of these assumptions has been that the role of Buddhism in the process of caste formation has often escaped notice. To anyone who reads Kautilya's Arthashastra with its heavy stress on the Varna system and then turn to Ashoka's edicts, the contrast is a striking one. The word Varna or Jati never appears in Ashoka's texts. Obedience to the Varna rules does not form even implicitly a part of the dharma that Ashoka propagated and whose principles he inscribed on rock and pillars. Insofar as Buddhism rejected the religious supremacy of the Brahmanas, it necessarily questioned the legitimacy of the Varna division inherited from the Vedas. And yet, it may be asked whether Buddhism did not have its own contribution to make to the development of the caste system. The karma doctrine, or the belief in the transmigration of souls which formed the bedrock of Buddhist philosophy, was an ideal rationalization of the caste system, creating a belief in its equity even among those who were its greatest victims. In the Manusmriti, it already appears as a firm part of the caste doctrine. Second, there was a stress on ahimsa. Kosambi attributed the stress on avoidance of animal killing in Buddhism to the irrationality of large-scale slaughter of livestock for sacrifice by Brahmanas once settled agriculture had replaced pastoralism. Kosambi did not, of course. So you see the extra number of sacrifices, Ashwamedha and all, that was being done because settled agriculture had replaced pastoralism. So they did not need that many animals, so they came up with a religious justification for it. Burning horses alive for a king's benefit. Kosambi did not, of course, intend to disparage the insincerity of the Buddha's disapproval of violence or cruelty. And after all, Ashoka condemned the massacres by his army in Kalinga. We know how much that is in that tone. We know that now. What he implied was that any criticism of the large-scale animal sacrifices would be popular among the cattle-raising Vaishya. But I would like respectfully to suggest what seems to me to be a more plausible reason why ahimsa should have become a popular doctrine. It provided reason for the subjugation and humiliation of the food-gathering communities. The Ashokan edicts contain injunctions against hunting and fishing, and the Buddhist texts look down on animal killing jatis as much as the Brahminical texts do. The Ashokan edicts contain injunctions against hunting and fishing, and the Buddhist texts look down on animal killing jatis as much as the Brahminical texts do. Indeed, here Buddhism also contributed to the ultimate denigration of the peasantry in the Varna structure. R.S. Sharma's exposition of how the Shudra and not the Vaishya Varna came to be regarded as the category to which peasants must belong is practically definitive. In this denigration, the Himsa doctrine too was made to play a part. Manu condemns the use of plough for the injury that its iron point causes to living creatures. This is echoed in later Buddhism. Singh says that the Buddha forbade monks from engaging in cultivation because this involved destroying lives by ploughing and watering field. It would therefore be wrong to suppose that the caste ideology has been exclusively Brahmanical in its development. No, he's not saying it's just the Buddhists and Jains who did it. He's saying they were as much a party to this. It would be wrong to suppose that the caste ideology has been exclusively Brahmanical in its development. The period from the rise of Buddhism in 500 BC to the Gupta age, 4th and 5th centuries AD, may then be supposed to be the period of the formation of the caste system and its supporting ideology, quote-unquote ideology. It is significant that outsiders were struck not by the quote-unquote hierarchy of the system, but by its hereditary occupations. Megasthenes in 300 BC, with his listing of the 7 castes, and Yuan Chuang, meaning Yuan Sang, both make unqualified statements. These guys' pronunciations change in every decade in academia. Megasthenes and Yuan Chuang both make unqualified statements in this respect, as do later foreign observers like Babar and Bernier. Being a relatively rigid form of division of labor, the caste system formed part of the relations of production, but the caste system operated in 2 different worlds of labor, and these 2 must be distinguished in order to better understand both the caste system and the social formation of which it was a part. Marx derived a very important insight from Richard Jones when he distinguished the artisan maintained by the village and the artisan of the town, wholly dependent on the vagaries of the market. In one case, the caste labor belonged to a natural economy, in the other to a commodity or monetized sector. Those who are familiar with Marx's writing on the Indian village community may remember that he locates the base of its economy on 2 opposite elements existing side by side, i.e., the domestic union of agriculture and manufacturing pursuits, limiting thereby the domain of exchange within the village, and an unalterable division of labor, with the artisans and menials belonging to particular castes as servants of the village as a whole, maintained through customary payments in kind or land allotments, dispensing again with commodity exchange. Max Weber gave to this kind of caste-determined labor the name of demiurgical labor. Modern sociologists since W.H. Weiser have been sprinkling cold water on this view. To them, the actual system was not of demiurgical labor but the Jajmani system, that is, a system of the artisans serving only particular families. For Louis Dumont, as one would expect, it becomes immediately a matter of a ritualistic relationship between certain upper caste families and the quote-unquote purity specialists, vis-a-vis the Brahmana and the barber, which was then extended to relationships with other artisans and laboring castes. So we are told that, quote, in the last analysis, the division of labor shows not a more or less gratuitous juxtaposition of religious and non-religious or economic tasks, but both the religious basis and the religious expression of interdependence. Further, it deduces interdependence from religion, end quote. Dumont has apparently let his edition run on without paying much attention to current historical work. In 1972, Hiroshi Fukuzawa published the results of his investigations in the 18th century records, in which Maharashtra is so rich. on which Sumit Guha has done his insane, incredible work on judge money system as well, agreeing with people like Irfan Habib on caste. His definite conclusion. Sumit Guha is an economic historian or economic history professor at University of Texas, Austin. His definite conclusion, closely based on documentary evidence, was that the Jajmani theory was applicable only to the family priesthood. The traditional 12 balutas, carpenter, smith, potter, leather worker, barber, etc., were basically village servants paid through land allotments or watan and out of peasant crops. So strong is Fukazawa's evidence that he is led to the perceptive comment that if modern village artisans appear to be servants of certain families alone, this is due to the decay of the old system under modern conditions. Holy shit. Holy shit. If modern village artisans appear to be servants of certain families alone, this is due to the decay of the old system under modern conditions. Historical evidence for the village servants, in fact, goes back to a fairly early period. Kosambi cites epigraphic evidence attesting to carpenters' plots in North Indian villages going back to the 5th century. Similarly, B.N.S. Yadava draws attention to the Lekha Paddhati documents of Gujarat circa 1000 AD, which speak of the 5 village artisans, Pancha Karuka, vis-a-vis the carpenter, ironsmith, potter, barber and washerman, entitled to receive handfuls of grains from the peasant. The Balahar or the village menial appears as the lowliest landholder in Barani's account of Alauddin Khalji's taxation measures, early 14th century, so the 1300s. The hereditary artisan and servant thus was of crucial importance in sustaining the self-sufficiency as well as the internal natural economy of the village. Such self-sufficiency not only isolated the village, but enlarged its capacity to deliver a larger part of the surplus to the ruling class, since it did not need much extra produce to exchange for its own imports. Oh my god, an autopilot society, a village running on its own, completely independent, decentralized. As the surplus was taken out of the village, it entered the realm of commodity exchange, as Marx particularly noted in his classic passage already cited on the Indian village community in Capital Volume 1. Outside the village, the artisan appears as an individual selling his wares on the market. The hereditary occupation by caste was necessary to enable quote-unquote special skill to be quote-unquote accumulated from generation to generation. The hereditary transmission sustained skill while excluding even horizontal mobility. In addition, the caste system possibly created another element of advantage for the ruling class. So the horizontal mobility was being sacrificed at the altar of job security. That's what Irfan Habib is pointing out. The caste system possibly created another element of advantage for the ruling class by giving a lowly status to many artisan castes. Artisan castes already appear among the mixed jatis in Manu, and in the 11th century Al-Biruni classes 8 professions, including those of weavers and shoemakers among the outcast Antyajas. Their depressed status and lack of mobility status, must surely have helped to curtail the powers of resistance of the artisans and so to keep wage costs low. So at this point it's benefiting rulers, but broadly speaking it does not benefit rulers, which he points out later on. Why do sociologists and other humanities writers have this tendency to differ so wildly in interpretation? You don't see it that much in hard sciences, the postmodern, and people are moving away from evidences, doing qualitative research, I experience accounts, lived experience. So the subjectivity is going on increasing. Irfan Habib, such Kumi's byproduct using those elite older English sound intellectual but doing what is new era English, Sunday learner? Such Kumi's byproduct, is that new era English that we should all pursue? Is that what you're saying? But which contemporary text actually addresses these depressed classes? Most of these historians make up their own narratives. They're not talking about today. They're talking about when that era which was being studied. They're not saying it's going on exactly in these ways right now. And in 85, of course, it was going on more. It was more visible. Okay, let's continue now. The caste system in its classic form could therefore function with as much ease in a natural economy as in a market-oriented one. In either case, it helped essentially to maintain not a fabric of imagined purity. If it did, this was incidental. Irfan Habib is saying, if at all there was an issue of purity, it was incidental. But it mainly maintains a system of class exploitation as rigorous as any other, because it's inevitable. That's why it's inevitable. That's why it exists everywhere in the world. In many ways, the beginning of the 13th century marks a quote-unquote break in Indian history. This break arises not only from the intrusion of Islam. We begin to see a social formation which is at last close to Marx's Oriental despotism as against the preceding age of Indian feudalism, delineated by Kosambi and R.S. Sharma. We must, however, allow for a much larger extent of commodity production and urbanization that Marx seems to have visualized for pre-colonial India. The caste structure in both villages and towns continued essentially to be the same as in the earlier period. As will be seen from what we have said in the foregoing section, the evidence for hereditary caste labor in villages and towns is practically continuous from ancient India to the 18th century. It is true that Islam in its law recognizes differences based only upon free man and slave and man and woman. Caste therefore is alien to its legal system. Nevertheless, the attitude of the Muslims towards the caste system was by no means one of disapprobation. When in 711 through 714 AD the Arabs conquered Sindh, their commander Muhammad ibn Qasim readily approved all the constraints placed upon the Jats under the previous regime, very similar to those prescribed for the Chandalas by the Manu Smriti. Muslim censures of Hinduism throughout the medieval period center around its alleged polytheism and idol worship, and never touch the question of the iniquity of caste. The only person who makes a mild criticism of it is the scientist and not theologian Al-Biruni circa 1030 AD, who said, "We Muslims of course stand entirely on the other side of the question, considering all men as equal except in piety." But such an egalitarian statement is almost unique. The 14th century historian Barani, in his Tarikh-i-Iruz Shahi, fervently craved for a hierarchical order based on birth, although he was thinking in terms of class rather than of castes, and does not appeal to the Hindu system as a suitable example. Insofar as the caste system helped, as we have seen, to generate larger revenues from the village and lower the wage costs in the cities. Hence, reservations will keep wage costs lower, guys. The Indo-Muslim regimes had every reason to protect it, however indifferent, if not hostile, they might have been to the Brahmanas as the chief idol worshippers. Does not this also mean that the supremacy of the Brahmanas was by no means essential for the continuance of the caste system? Nevertheless, the caste system had to undergo certain adjustments and changes which must be recognized as important, not as a result of the policy of the sultans, but of the new circumstances. In the first place, the new ruling classes and their dependents brought not only demand for new products and new kinds of services from their Central and Asian backgrounds, but also a fairly wide range of new craft technology. Kosambi, with his usual perceptiveness, spoke of the Islamic raiders breaking hidebound custom in the adoption and transmission of new techniques. Among the technological devices which came early 13th and 14th centuries were right-angled gearing for the final form of the Persian wheel, the spinning wheel, paper manufacture, vault construction, use of bitumen and lime cement, iron horseshoe, and so on. These necessitated, in some cases, the creation of new professions, for example, paper makers, lime mixers, and in others, the learning of new devices. In general, one can postulate the need for a considerable expansion of the artisan population to accompany what in fact may be designated the third urban revolution in Indian history. The pressure of the new circumstances led initially to large-scale slave trading and the emergence of slave labor as a significant component of urban labor during the 13th and 14th centuries. Slavery in India was started by Muslim kings, guys. That's what Irfan Habib is hinting at. The numbers of slaves in the Sultan's establishments were very high, 50,000 under Alauddin Khalji, 1,80,000 under Firuz Tughlaq. Barani judges the level of prices by referring to slave prices, and the presence of slaves was almost all pervasive. Slaves were in effect deprived of caste and converted to Islam, could be put to almost any task or learn any trade. Manumitted in course of time, they probably created along with artisan immigrants the core of many Muslim artisan and laboring communities. There was also in time a conversion of free elements, possibly in many cases sections of castes splitting off from their parent bodies in search of higher status or willing to take to occupations of practices not permitted to them previously. There thus arose, in course of time, a substantial Muslim population. Caste undoubtedly continued to exercise its influence on those communities. To judge from their practices as reported since the 19th century, weavers, butchers, barbers, and others had strong tendencies to be endogamous. The menial castes duplicated themselves as common communities among Muslims, not untouchable but still kept separate and held in contempt. Nonetheless, it would still be correct to say that sectors of Muslim populations remained outside the caste framework even in its most rudimentary form, and in any case, the framework remained weak, since both shifts of occupation and deviations from endogamy could occur. In other words, there was always a much greater degree of mobility. It is questionable whether the presence of such relatively caste-free populations at all undermined the caste system. Such populations might indeed have reinforced it by providing reserve labor for new professions or occupations without causing any disruptions to the structure of existing castes. But it is also doubtful whether the caste system was so completely devoid of capacity for mobility as has been assumed by Max Weber. Maurice de Morris in a notable paper argues that in actual practice the caste system has been vastly different from how one thinks it should have operated on the basis of the law book, or what Dumont calls its quote-unquote ideology. Castes divided to enable one section to take to new professions. Fukuzawa, just change your caste. Fukuzawa draws attention to a well-documented caste from 18th century Maharashtra where a section of tailors took to dyeing and yet another took to indigo dyeing and set up as endogamous subcastes. A historically singular case is that of the Jats, a pastoral Chandala-like tribe in 8th century Sindh who attained Shudra status by the 11th century, according to Al-Biruni, and had become peasants par excellence of Vaishya status by the 17th century, according to the Dabistani Mazhabi. The shift to peasant agriculture was probably accompanied by a process of Sanskritization, a process which continued even with the Jat rebellion of the 17th century, as section of the Jats began to aspire to the position of zamindars and the status of Rajputs. Moreover, where Sanskritization failed or was too slow a process, hearing began to be given to monotheistic movements which condemned the ideology, the quote-unquote ideology of the caste system. It may be that the monotheistic belief of Islam and the legal equality of the Muslim community exercised a certain influence on these movements. He's saying it may be that. But the stress on equality and condemnation of caste and ritual observance was certainly much greater than is to be found in any contemporary Islamic preaching. Most of its great teachers belonged to the low jatis: Namdev, a calico printer; Kabir, a weaver; Raidas, a scavenger; Sai, a barber; Dadu, a cotton carder; Dhanna, a Jat peasant. In beautiful verse composed in the name of Dhanna Jat, the fifth Guru of the Sikhs, Guru Arjun, insists on God's special grace for such lowly worshippers. In these communities or panths, the doors were open to people of all castes. The Satnami sect, which arose in the 17th century, by the way, Hans Zimmer's drummer, guys, a Canadian Indian man, his name is Satnam Ramgotra. He's Hindu, I thought he's Sikh. He wears a pagri, but he is, I think, some Punjabi anti-caste sect. I forgot, Namdevi or Gurudevi Panth, I don't remember shit. what are they called? Ravidasi, I think, yeah. His old CSK back. Where was I gone, guys? Sandy Lerner, yes, we have discussed that in our discussion of the paper by Richard Eaton. See what can happen if you don't follow Christian slave morality and apologize for greatness by giving reservations. Chandals can become Rajputs. We need docu-series on such social mobilities. কিছুর জন্য বাড়া কিছু ফান্ড পাওয়া যাচ্ছে না, দেখি হবে, করতে হবে নেক্সট 5 বছরের মধ্যে সব, সবাই বাড়া ইভেন্ট আর সেমিনার নেটওয়ার্কিংই করে চলেছে লোকে। তারপরে পডকাস্টের বাজেট দিলে বাড়া ইয়ে হামকো পড়ায় নেই গিয়া, वो पढ़ाया नहीं गया, পড়ায় নেই গিয়া তো এসবও বলবে না, খালি র্যান্ডম হিস্টোরিক্যাল ঘটনা বলি। The Satnami sect, which arose in the 17th century, which with some allegiance to Kabir, contained goldsmiths, carpenters, sweepers and tanners according to one account, and peasants and traders of small capital according to another. The Sikh community in the 17th century consisted in bulk of Jat peasantry. Early in the next century, the complaint was being made that authority could be given among them to the lowliest sweeper and tanner, filthier than whom there is no race in Hindustan. The practices of these panths forbade caste distinctions within the community, and there was a tendency in the communities, as with the Satnamis, amongst whom this was prescribed by scripture to become endogamous. Prescribed by scripture. The net result was the creation of religious communities which drew their following from the caste framework, but which ultimately returned to the framework, though usually at a higher rank than at the time of their departure from it. This had happened before, as in the case of the Lingayats in Karnataka, and these movements of the 16th and 17th centuries similarly made necessary adjustments in the caste system without, however, subverting it. The caste system therefore remained an important pillar of the system of class exploitation in medieval India. By class exploitation, they simply mean economic functions, economic phenomenons. As we have said before, its chief beneficiaries could only be the ruling classes. In the medieval case, these were first the nobility and the second the rural superior class, the zamindars. To the extent that the political structure was sustained by the zamindars, caste again was important, since the zamindars by and large belonged to the quote-unquote dominant castes, which maintained their position by force. It is worth remembering that when Abul Fazl in his detailed statistical tables of the Mughal Empire in Ain-i-Akbari in 1595 through 1596 gives the caste of zamindars of each locality, this information is followed not by the area of land they held, but by the numbers of their retainers, horse and foot. There was, therefore, an undoubted connection between caste dominance and military power. Barrington Moore Jr. expresses some surprise that in his detailed descriptions of the Mughal Indian economy, W.H. Morland should have had so little to say on caste. This applies to some of my own work as well. The reason perhaps is that when one looks at the specific relations, such as those of the peasant and the tax appropriator, all the petty producer and the merchant, merchant caste is not immediately visible. What it did mainly was to provide a large part of the setting for these relations. It divided the agrarian classes into two antagonistic camps, the caste peasants and the menial laborers. Hence the fight between Dalits and OBCs even today, I guess. And it stabilized the division of labor in petty production. But it is questionable if these functions were crucial enough for us to propound that caste defined the form of the labor process in medieval India, circa 1200 to 1750 AD. The factors of mobility and competition were present to a certain degree, as we have seen. Iran was very similar to India in its economic and political organization in medieval times, but without the benefit of the caste system. Can we nevertheless say that Mughal India and Safavid Iran belonged to two separate social formations, just because one had caste and the other lacked it? Any comment on the matter can at present be only tentative, and one may look forward hopefully to more discussion on the subject. But one final word before we leave the question of caste in medieval India. Now the aspect of Hindu unity will come about in the last paragraph though. I'm calling that Hindu unity, but you'll see why it's definitely Hindu unity. Any class formation like medieval Indian society was bound to generate internal tensions, finding expression notably in the struggles of the oppressed. India has a history of peasant uprisings, going back to the revolt of the buffalo riding Kaivartas of Bengal in 11th century. But it is from the 17th century that we get perhaps the richest evidence of peasant uprisings. One great weakness of these uprisings, when compared to those of Europe or China, is the rebels' extremely backward class consciousness. Peasant rebels appear as zamindars' followers, the Marathas, or members of religious communities like Sikhs or Satnamis, or of castes or tribes like the Jats and Afghans. They fail to see themselves as peasants or to raise economic or social demands for any section of the peasants. It seems to me that caste provides part of the reason for this failure. It prevented peasants of one caste from finding common ground with those of another, and so all the time undermined the growth of self-awareness of the peasantry as a class. And this is the very reason why today as well reservation is going on, propagating this further and harder, drilling casteism, caste identification harder down their veins, preventing urbanization, and therefore being an easier vote bank. And therefore all of them are dividing themselves among castes when they should unite as a political unit under Hindutva or Indian whatever, or Biharis or UPs, and simply demand more free markets and capitalism and jobs and not fucking freebies. The history of caste in the foregoing pages has been brought close enough to modern times. I do not intend to pursue it further, but a few concluding remarks may still be offered. Okay, before the concluding remarks, I'll check the comment section once again. No, he's citing Kosambi repeatedly, and Kosambi has all the citations you can hope to dream of. Because India is more complex than a European kingdom. Absolutely. The climate and temperature is different. The pathogen, the stress, anxiety related to pathogens is different. More fertile grounds, more things to do, more worry about hygiene, things rotting. It's a hot country. RSS will read this and say, sir, this is why we are trying to keep him and What about Abhijit Mitra saying slaves having access to power and rapid mobility to climb up a rank ladder like Malik Kafur and Malik Ambar? There have been cases like that. Habib is not really denying that. He is saying broadly it would not have happened all that much. Landholders got which Varna in caste hierarchy in British census, which Varna they were before becoming landholders community. Mainly they became Kshatriyas. All Kshatriyas today are, most of them are simply Zamindars. Or they still call themselves Brahmins, but they have surnames of Chaudhary and etc. Because they also wanted to identify as Zamindars. I have Brahmin friends with Chaudhary surnames because they simply became Zamindars at one point while also being Brahmins. On the other hand, random Mahajans accumulated wealth and became zamindars, bought up land, and also declared themselves Kshatriya, Kaista, etc. in Bengal, Bangladesh, etc. Okay, concluding thoughts. In 1853, discussing the results of British rule, Marx predicted that modern history resulting from the railway system will dissolve the hereditary divisions of labour upon which rest the Indian castes, those decisive impediments to Indian progress and Indian power. It has become customary to deride this statement because of Louis Dumont as having been too optimistic. But it will be futile to deny that modern conditions have gravely shaken the economic basis of the caste system. Oh, is it? Capitalism works. This is not only because workers of several castes come together on the factory bench, and once this happens, the traditional division of labor begins to collapse. Even more important has been the fact that industrial production has destroyed the crafts of a whole series of professional or artisanal castes. This process began with the import of Lancashire cloth even before Marx was writing. The basis of the caste division of labor was weakened due to one further factor. As Surendra J. Patel has pointed out, commercialization of agriculture has converted large numbers of peasants into landless laborers, so that no longer does landlessness remain a monopoly of the menial castes. though they still form in most areas its largest contingent. But if the economic base of the caste system has been shaken, can the same be said of its ideology? Endogamy continues to reinforce caste. This is where Irfan Habib asks some questions which only Max Weber, Pierre Bourdieu, and René Girard can answer, guys. That's where we come in. Hindutva 2.0 comes in. Endogamy continues to reinforce caste, and there has been a process of territorial enlargement of castes through mutual identification and absorption. Sanskritization, which modernization at one level strongly fosters, converts the erstwhile victims of the system into its votaries. So long as the conflict of interest between landless labor and landholding classes remains, there is an incentive for all castes to combine against the untouchables, whom we euphemistically call the scheduled castes. Caste still remains perhaps the single most important divisive factor in our country. Then, what's the solution? Hindu unity, isn't it? For all those who wish to see the Indian people unite in a struggle for their material and spiritual liberalization, it is of utmost importance that there be a renewed effort to eradicate the sway that caste continues to hold over the minds of our people. Is this anything different from what Savarkar or Mohan Bhagwat would say? What Marx called the decisive impediment to Indian progress could only then be removed, and caste at last relegated to history, to which it properly belongs, guys. Hindu unity is the goal, then. Thank you for coming to my talk. Bhumihar caste are most disputed. Neon is saying, Dada, you had told me on Vanguard group once that you would ask mystery sociologist about the history of Boiddos in Bengal. I have never found all that much literature. I contacted a Boiddo expert PhD guy. He said he can't come right now because he is worried his research might get leaked and stuff. He said he'll contact later. Either he didn't contact or I didn't contact him. I still have his number. If you all are interested, then I'll call him back. But there's such less viewership, I'm thinking I'll have to move on from academic videos as much as possible, because it's going to get impossible now. Are you in Vanguard? Holy shit, what's your real name, bro? By what name are you there in Vanguard? He's definitely a Sanghi, lol. How to avoid being either Neela Kabutar or Neel Kamal? By pushing our view of castes, nothing else. Hindus will need to develop caste independent practices. I'm saying Hindus don't have to consciously do anything. Hindus will have to just stop being forced to identify with their castes by the state. They will forget it in one generation. भाई urbanization हो जाएगा, इधर उधर काम करने जाएंगे, सब भूल जाएंगे. उतना कोई किसी के पास भोसड़ी के इंसेंटिव नहीं है अदर देन स्टेट आस्किंग यू टू डू इट. इंसेंटिव के बिना किसी को कुछ लौड़ा उखाड़ना नहीं पड़ेगा. कास्ट आइडेंटिटी से कोई कुछ नहीं करेगा, सब भूल जाएंगे. आई एम सेइंग इवन इफ यू वांट टू बी कास्टिस्ट यू वोंट बी एबल टू, बिकॉज यू जस्ट वोंट हैव टाइम फॉर इट टू प्ले योर फैंसी ड्रेस पार्टी कॉम्पिटिशन. Yeah. Thanks Mayuresh Raik. প্রথম থেকেই আজকেই তো কথা হচ্ছিল অ্যাবর্শনের ব্যাপারে. এইবার যাস সালা, তুই কোন নামে নিয়ন? Okay then, I'll take your leave now. I wanted to do the Sajjan Singh live stream today as well, but a lot of my extra time went to waste because of trying to do a podcast with Professor Drone Banerjee, and I could not set up a podcast streaming situation with OBS. That's why. Other than that, this was fun. Next day we will do Sajjan Singh, and Abhay has sent many other nice stuff as well that we will do live reactions on. I don't like doing live reactions all that much. That's my problem, because it's sort of like, why commenting on other stuff instead. Tomorrow time for Dominion Day of, oh yeah. So earlier you could buy yourself a so-called upper caste with money, and now you have to burn. Yes bro, it's become more rigid now. It was flexible before. Now you can't do anything about it. It's set in stone by the state today. It's being kept in stone by the state today. Should every jati forget their jati for casteism? But linguistic, regional, gender, etc. identity doesn't need to dissolve for discrimination. Here to learn. The moment you get into the world of should or shouldn't, it's a pointless battle getting people worked up for no reason. I'm saying there's no reason for should and stuff. It will happen on its own if just the state stops pushing this shit. sad that academic streams are raking in views. I'm hoping it will after I start doing the podcasts. A nice gentleman, a benefactor, is setting up a podcast studio for us. We'll of course reveal names when it starts fully. In his studio, we will do regular podcasts with all sorts of people. With that mainstream view, I'm hoping some viewership for the live streams will increase as well. I mean, for the academic stuff. Who is brave enough to push it? Where do they even start? First of all, hire academics who say this stuff in the mainstream. There are academics who are doing research on this. They are not getting hired. Irfan Habib is not being asked to say these things, etc. Send these academics to debates. Ask your friends in every channel to do caste discourses, panel discussions, debates, etc. Also, a thought, wouldn't migrating to a new area mean you can cook up a story and become Rudvik Perepa, bhai. I have to call you Bhosrike, little just for the sake of impact here. Bhosrike, that is the main theme of the paper by Hitesh Ranjan Channal, which I have called, the live stream is called How to Buy Your Caste. I will discuss that paper also once again, okay, then that will be fun. That research is mainly on Eastern India, Odisha and Bengal as far as I remember, or only Bengal. But it's exactly that. Brahmins handing out genealogies. Yeah. Thanks guys. See you all soon. Bye bye. Good night.
তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা তলরে যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে যদি আলো না ধরে ওরে ওরে ও আলো না ধরে যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় ঘরে তবে বজ্রা দলে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো রে